Welcome to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. Governor Cox picked to run the new government records office, fought to keep Sean Rhea's calendar private. Utah Lake isn't gross anymore. Here's why, according to officials. And a Bear Lake namesake returned recently. Then it was struck and killed. Joining me today are Salt Lake Tribune politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Good morning.
Thank you. Tribune reporter Paighten Harkins is with us.
Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. Thank you for being with us. Later in the program, we'll be talking with Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune Cache Valley reporter Clarissa Casper. Robert Gehrke, let's start with you and this interesting story about the new government records office. Maybe let's start there. What was the old process and what's the new process?
Right. So for about the last 30 plus years, if there's a dispute over whether records should be public or not, those appeals would go to the State Records Committee, which is a panel made up of citizens, government representatives, 7 members. They would decide, yes, these should be public, no, they shouldn't be, and so they were the arbiters of those disagreements over the release of public records. This past session, the legislature didn't like how that process was working. They thought that there were rulings that were incorrect, that went against the government, frankly, and that it was taking too long, sometimes up to like 7 months, to get these appeals through the process. So they decided it would be. They looked to some other states, places like Ohio, have administrative law judges who decide these rather than a panel of citizens or members, and decided to go with appoint one member who would be an administrative law judge, a legal background, and that person would be responsible for deciding these appeals. So they disbanded the records committee, and this week the governor appointed that one member who's going to be responsible for making these decisions.
Before we get there, I want to get a little more back in the process. There's a big dispute over this, right? And the opponents of any changes at all would tell you that before these changes, Utah had one of the best, in their view, processes in the nation.
Yeah, it was a pretty controversial decision. I mean, the criticism that they were finding or issuing rulings that were later overturned is just factually not held up by the data. 98, 99% of the rulings that they issued, really only one ruling that they issued was overturned by a court. The rest of them they got right, but the legislature, again, criticized the time it took them because we were seeing so many more records requests, which means records denials, which means appeals. And so it was taking them months to get through these. I mean, that's a valid criticism. But however, they were also hamstrung last year because for about 7 months, I believe it ended up being, the governor refused to appoint members to the records committee. So they had a hard time getting a quorum to do business. So that obviously hamstrung them to a significant degree. So yeah, it's just a different direction, I guess. Utah was pointed to as a model because you did have this sort of diverse group of people from all walks of life. You had a representative of the governor's office. You had a representative of cities and towns. You had, some citizen representatives, and so it had functioned pretty well, I think, by and large, for like I said, over 30 years. But they wanted to go a different direction. So this is the step that the governor took of nominating Lonnie Pearson is the guy's name. He was the records officer at the Attorney General's office for I don't remember how long it was off the top of my head, but he, a long time, at least 15 years. And he's going to be the person who's going forward is going to be responsible for hearing these appeals and deciding whether the records are released or not.
You talked to a professor at Kent State University, a professor of media and journalism, who said, I guess since this is a one-person show now, that the person appointed is really going to set the tone. So this is important. What do we know about Lonnie Pearson?
Yeah, that professor, you're right. The point he was making was if you're going to invest all this power and decision-making power in one person, who that person is matters a lot. And so Lonnie comes from a background from the Attorney General's office. where he, if you made an open records request to the Attorney General's office, he'd be the guy who would be responsible for responding to it. And there's the Attorney General's office over the years has not been a pillar of transparency. There was actually an audit that was done by the legislature that criticized the transparency of the Attorney General's office and said it made it very difficult for the public or for the legislature to hold the Attorney General accountable. One of the high-profile recent cases that Lonnie was involved in is when the Tribune and KSL asked for copies of Sean Reyes's official calendars, which pretty explicitly was a public record under the law. They denied that request. They denied the appeal. Went to the State Records Committee. Lonnie argued that these are not public records. The committee unanimously ruled that they were. The Attorney General's office then appealed to the district court, and the district judge said, no, these are public records. That ended up costing the state about $130,000 plus in attorney's fees when the state lost that. And so subsequently, the legislature changed the law and just said calendars are not public records going forward. And they also changed the law so the state wouldn't have to pay attorney's fees when they lose. So 2 strikes, I think, they're against government transparency, pretty clearly. Lonnie's, I guess, to put too fine a point on it, Lonnie's track record is a little bit, it's not overwhelmingly favoring transparency. There's actually been a lot of criticism recently from conservative groups who are upset about the way that the governor's office withheld voting records from the last election. These are the groups that thought that Phil Lyman maybe should have won the election, and they aren't happy about the signature packets that were withheld. That also went and ultimately was there was input, at least from the Attorney General's office, on some of the aspects of that. So there's some questions about it. His confirmation hearing is going to be Monday before the Senate Government Operations Committee. So there'll be some airing of they'll do a deep dive into his history and track record and decide if they want to confirm him to that position.
Do you have an idea how I guess I'll ask this: why was the governor not appointing new members to the old committee?
Well, there was some criticism that there was concern, I guess, among some senators with with 1 or 2 of the nominees, and so they weren't going to hold a confirmation hearing. It just created this whole backlog where there were with these vacancies and the committee's inability to do it. Ultimately, they got the positions filled, but only obviously for a few months before the legislature decided to disband it. And so, going forward, we'll see how it works. I mean, potentially, it could streamline the process, and we could get rulings on cases a lot more quickly. Flip side of that is, if the ruling is always that the records shouldn't be public, that doesn't help the process from a government transparency standpoint. The idea, according to Senator Mike McKell, who sponsored the bill, is we want to make this quicker. We want to make it more efficient, less expensive, and more predictable. He thinks that the Records Committee, like I said, was issuing rulings that were contrary to the law, and so we'll see how it goes. I mean, right now there's a backlog, I believe, of at least like 6 or 7 dozen appeals that were pending before the State Records Committee when they were abandoned, plus anything that's come in, subsequent to their to their last meeting, which I believe was in April. It might have been May. No, it was April. So there's if Lonnie is confirmed, he's going to have a big pile of appeals on his plate when he has day one in the office. The other interesting thing, though, that this office is tasked with is doing records training for records officials at local governments and school districts and so forth, to make sure that the people who are responding to those in the initial requests have the experience, training, and background that they need to get better decisions out of the gate. So you presumably would have fewer appeals. So that's going to be a big part of the presumably Lonnie's job when he takes office.
Now, under the current setup, can a decision of the government records officer be appealed?
Yeah, so the government records officer will issue a ruling that can still be appealed to district court, which is the same way that worked with the records committee. If you don't like the ruling that the state records committee issued, like for example, with Sean Reyes's calendars, the records committee said that they should be public. The attorney general's office disagreed with that, and they appealed that to a district court judge, and the judge upheld the ruling. Frankly, from there you can go to the appeals court and the Supreme Court if you feel strongly enough about it. It doesn't happen often, but there are a number of cases that have gone all the way to the Utah Supreme Court and sort of set some pretty compelling precedent, I guess, for public records. As I mentioned, though, one of the things that they also changed this past legislative session is if you do take if you do appeal it to a district court or to the appeal court or the Supreme Court, you can no longer collect attorney's fees if you win. And so that means obviously that there's going to be a lot of cost associated with these appeals now going forward that is going to have to be borne either by the media outlets or by the members of the public who request these things, and regardless of if they win or lose. So that's going to be a big blow. I mean, it's going to, to take a case to the Utah Supreme Court, for example, is probably going to cost you $200,000 to $300,000. As I mentioned, with this Sean Reyes records case that only went to district court, only went to that first level. The state spent $130,000 on attorney's fees, paying the plaintiff's attorneys, the media outlets attorneys in that one. So, you can appeal it, I guess, is yes is the short answer, but there are costs associated with that now that you can't recoup when assuming you end up prevailing in the case. If the government acted inappropriately and denied you records that you should have had access to, you can't recoup the cost for challenging that anymore.
If you just joined us, you're listening to Behind the Headlines, and I'm talking with politics reporter for the Tribune, Robert Gehrke. Robert, I want to talk about another story. Here's the headline. A Utah lawyer was punished for filing a brief with fake precedent made up by an artificial intelligence. And I'll skip ahead a little bit in your story. Robert, you talked to prominent attorney Greg Skordas, who said attorneys are routinely using artificial intelligence. I don't know how I feel about that, but anyway, in this case, there was a problem.
Yeah. So Greg says, attorneys are using it all the time. He's a lot more than people might realize. In this particular case, there was a brief filed with the Court of Appeals that cited to a precedent that didn't exist. He was saying that this Royer v. Dickinson case supported his argument that the Court of Appeals should hear a case that, sorry, my dog is now barking at me. So sorry, I'll start over. He said that this case, Royer v. Nelson, supported his argument that the Court of Appeals should hear an appeal that he was trying to get them to review. The problem is that the opposing counsel was looking for Royer v. Nelson and couldn't find it. It didn't exist anywhere in the appeals court rulings previous. And so, they put it into ChatGPT, and ChatGPT came back and said, yeah, this is the case. So it was pretty clear at that point that the attorney who cited this Royer v. Nelson case was using ChatGPT, and they, there were several other cases that were, I guess, incorrectly described and cited in this brief that he filed, and so they suggested that he was using AI, and that he should be sanctioned for it. When he was confronted with this by the appeals court, he said, that I had a law clerk who was doing the research and I didn't know that they were using AI. And the attorney didn't review the brief or didn't review it carefully enough before signing his name to it and submitting it to the court. So that's a big no-no. We'll put it that way. The court didn't like that. They sanctioned him. They said you have to pay the attorney's fees for the opposing counsel that, discovered this, plus refund any attorney's fees you charged to your client, because obviously the work that they got was not up to snuff. And then they directed him to make $1,000 donation to And Justice for All, which is a entity, a nonprofit that provides free or reduced legal services to vulnerable communities. So it's interesting though, because this is the first time on record that this has happened in Utah. And like I said, that doesn't mean that attorneys haven't used it in the past, but this is the first time an attorney's been caught using it, and that we had this sort of snafu, I guess, with the case being cited that didn't exist. So, kind of a
See, Robert's cut out there.
so many.
Oh, yeah, you cut out just a moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, this case, first time it's happened in the state, that somebody's been caught doing it at least, but also sort of a sign of the times, right? I mean, the AI is permeating so many facets of our society and our work, and the legal profession is no exception. But also sort of a wake up call, I guess, to any attorney who might consider using AI for legal research, that you got to be careful what you're citing to, or else you could end up in a little bit of trouble. One more thing I should add: they said that I talked to the attorney. His name is Richard Bednar. I talked to his lawyer who was representing him in this part with the sanctions, and he said they're not aware that the Bar Association is doing any kind of disciplinary investigation, but he said he wouldn't be surprised if they did, just because this is something that also under bar rules is the bar. To be clear, says that they don't comment on potential pending investigations. So it's a little unclear where that one stands right now.
Interesting case. Yeah, AI is permeating our lives. We've been talking with politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Thanks, Robert.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll have underplayed stories of the week later in the program. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. Coming up, following a break, I'll be talking with reporter Paighten Harkins. Here's the headline: Utah Lake isn't gross anymore. Here's why, according to officials. More following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We bring in now Salt Lake Tribune reporter Paighten Harkins. Paighten, thanks for joining us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I love this headline: Utah Lake isn't gross anymore. I think this is the authorities are trying to convince the public, hey, there's been a cleanup. I was struck by the vision that many officials in Utah County have. They point to Lake Tahoe. They say, hey, Utah Lake could kind of have that economic impact.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when they said it too, because I don't know if you've ever visited any. They mentioned Lake Tahoe and Coeur d'Alene up in Idaho, and if you've ever visited those places, your visions of those two places versus what you might see overlooking Utah Lake is a little bit different. But I think the idea was not necessarily to recreate those kind of lake towns, but to have the lake be the center of all these various communities in Utah County that are around its shoreline. So I know that line maybe had some people scratching their heads, but I think that's kind of what they're getting at. Less of a off to the side thing and more of the center of the community.
So many Utah County communities are right on the lake: Saratoga Springs, American Fork, Orem, Vineyard, Provo. Mm-hmm. But I've kind of experienced this. I don't live in Utah County, but kind of the attitude has been for a long time, well, yeah, the lake's there, but we don't really pay attention to it that much.
Yeah, and that seems to be the sort of predominant attitude from locals specifically. Like the Utah Lake Authority did a survey of, residents of Utah County and, various people that might use the lake. And they found that, people who have been living in Utah have this kind of negative associations with Utah Lake. And I mean, for good reason, as the story gets into, but they found that, new residents actually did not have these same issues, but they found that famously Utah County is growing, quite a bit. And so they're bringing in all these new people who don't have these negative associations with Utah Lake. But then the survey also found that as these new people kind of get settled, they talk to the locals and then their perceptions become more negative, and then they build back up. But it's just kind of interesting, the reputation that can linger at a place.
So maybe go back into history. What were some of the problems, and then bring those problems up closer to modern times.
Sure. So, the Utah Lake is this, large freshwater lake. It's filled from the, American Fork River, Provo River, Spanish Fork River, Hobble Creek, all this stuff. It then, flows into the Great Salt Lake. So it's really important. It goes down the Jordan River to the Great Salt Lake, all this stuff. But, you know, sort of in the decades between when the Mormon pioneers arrived and now, it's had, problems with pollution. There wasn't the Clean Water Act, for the longest time. And so, raw sewage from all these communities that built up around the lake because it was, a place to build up around. It was a body of water with fish and, all this stuff in it. So it made a lot of sense to build up around it. But then, raw sewage, fertilizer from agriculture, industrial waste from the various, steel mills and stuff that came up around it kind of dirtied the water. At the same time, they were bringing in carp to kind of supplement the food sources in the lake because they'd overfished it. And so then the carp just kind of went crazy and took over the lake. At one point in, I think, 2008, they made up 90% of the lake's biomass, which I didn't know what biomass was, but that's the weight of all the living things inside of an ecosystem, which is kind of creepy if you think about how many fish there must have been in there. And so it had problems with invasive carp that were muddying up the water and, outcompeting all the native species, all these other invasive stuff. And just in the last couple decades, they've been really working to, clean up the water to make it to where people don't, feel like they're going to, have a negative health consequence from swimming in it or something. They're trying to also, make it to where if you're going fishing, maybe you'll catch more than just carp, also create, an ecosystem for fish. And they've put all these new amenities on it and all this stuff. But yeah, the problem is that the reputation seems to have lasting consequences. And so they're trying to tell people, it's not gross anymore. Get back out here.
Algae is also, algae continues to be a problem, I think.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting. I went to a news conference the Utah Lake Authority put on, and they said that, the quantity of harmful algal blooms is down. And there's an ongoing study to just kind of get a baseline of what, apparently a baseline does not exist for water quality there. And so they're trying to figure it out. But, I asked the Department of Environmental Quality who oversees these, advisories that go out for harmful algal blooms and stuff like that. And they said that they actually didn't have the data to be able to tell you if it's trending up or down. But, these Utah County officials seem to believe that, algae is down. And, that's important because those algal blooms, I mean, if you or your dog or whoever gets in contact with them, it can make you sick. And some people report that their animals have died.
Yeah, there was at least one report that a dog died out there. We don't know whether it was algae, right? I want to quote this. There's a Utah County Commissioner who says the perception that the lake is dirty and nasty and algae is going to kill your dog is just not reality. That's what officials are dealing with, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. It just kind of speaks to, again, the strength of, convictions and perceptions when you've grown up around a body of water your whole life. I mean, it's hard to probably change, the ideas that you have about it. I mean, you look in the comments section of this story, and a lot of people are saying oh, this reminds me of the mayor in Jaws, everybody come out and swim, the water's fine, but I went and looked at Utah Lake. I didn't swim in it or anything, but I mean, it was gorgeous. Birds, chirping, flying around. I mean, it was nice. I enjoyed it.
Now, a part of the plan is to make it more accessible. So I guess they're putting in access points and marinas and stuff.
Yeah, and to a certain extent, a lot of that exists, and they're kind of just trying to improve it. Like in the course of reporting the story, I think the day it was due or something, they opened a new marina or opened a revamped marina around the American Fork area. They've done a lot of restoration near Provo and sort of what they're calling the Skipper Bay area near where they've restored the Provo River Delta by the Provo airport. And yeah, it seems like they're eyeing kind of more development around those sort of northern towns that are growing so much, like Saratoga Springs and Lehigh and all that stuff. And so they're eyeing more development in the future. But right now, I mean, they're saying there's quite a bit. And one of the other things they tout about Utah Lake is that it has a few dozen, I believe, access points, and the vast majority of them are free. And they like to tell people that too. It doesn't have to cost you a bunch of money, they say, to go out to Utah Lake.
Did you talk to people who are, I guess, back to enjoying the lake?
Yeah, I did. The person that ended up in the story, she actually grew up around Utah Lake, but doesn't live in Utah anymore. And she talked about, her various memories on the lake, and how she was hoping to get back out there. But I talked to somebody who didn't actually end up in the story, and he also grew up around Utah Lake and talked about, going on like going out with Boy Scouts and, looking at stuff and kind of falling off. And then he was telling me just, a couple weeks before I reached out to him that he had gone, out with his family and went birding and walked around some of the new trails and stuff and really enjoyed it and thought he'd be going back. So it seems like if you can, get people out there to see it, they do want to come back, but it's just kind of getting them to go there.
Some experts were telling you that as goes Utah Lake, so will go Great Salt Lake. In other words, you have to fix the health of Utah Lake if you want to help Great Salt Lake.
Yeah, which I don't know that, people kind of think that water flows north to south, and so because that, it makes sense that water would go down, but that's not how it works all the time. A lake actually flows, through the Jordan River into Great Salt Lake. And so I think it gets about a third of its water from Great Salt Lake. It's about a third of its water from Utah Lake. And so that survey that I was talking about earlier, that the Utah Lake Authority put out, it found that people cared way more about conserving Great Salt Lake. And so the Utah County officials are like, do you all not understand that we have to care about both in order to care about one,
Some interesting quotes in the story from BYU professor Ben Abbott. He said there's the physical lake and then there's the lake in our imaginations. He said if you want to really make the lake healthy, you need to have people, I guess, turn around and face the lake in their imaginations.
Yeah, exactly. You need to face it in order for it to. Basically, you just need to care about it. It just speaks to the idea that, if you don't use it, you lose it, or something like that. And so he was just saying that, we can do all this stuff. We can make the lake, quantitatively better, it can be demonstrably better, but the investment and the opportunities at the lake are only as much as people being willing to buy in and go there.
We're talking with Salt Lake Tribune reporter Paighten Harkins. I want to talk about another story here, Paighten. Attention, dirty soda lovers. It's healthier to eat sugar than drink it. That's according to BYU researchers, which I didn't know. I like me a soda every once in a while. So tell me a little bit about this study. It's okay to eat, not a whole huge quantity of sugar, but be careful about drinking sugar.
Yeah, it was a meta-analysis that some BYU researchers did alongside some German researchers, and they were just looking at health outcomes between when people would, eat their sugar versus drink their sugar. And they found that, there was a much higher correlation between drinking your sugar. So, drinking a juice like an apple juice or an orange juice, or drinking a Coca-Cola or something, than if you were to have it's like 20 grams of sugar eaten in, like, say, a cookie or an apple, or something that has, sugar in it. And I think it has to do with how your body processes, the sugar when you're eating it versus drinking it. But yeah, it's kind of cool research. It challenges this assumption that, all sugars uniformly elevate your risk. And the risk they were looking at specifically was type 2 diabetes. So,
interestingly, you talk a little bit about culture in the story. You, at least members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints famously are not supposed to drink alcohol or coffee. And so a lot of members of the church have gravitated, their sin, quote unquote, is sodas.
Yeah. And that's what, when I got this, when the spokesperson at BYU emailed me this research, that was where my mind initially went. I wondered if the researchers were kind of responding to this Utah stereotype. Swig claims to have originated dirty soda in Utah in 2010. And then, since then, all these soda franchises have been popping up, not only in Utah, but now, coast to coast. And so yeah, and it just made me wonder if these researchers kind of had that on their mind when they sought this research topic out. And they told me that they didn't, but they also thought it was interesting, and they hoped that, their research would show people that, like, your vice also can have real consequences, and moderation there too is important.
Um, just briefly, at the end of the story, you treat a question about diet sodas. So, the study has found that, be careful with sodas. What about diet sodas?
Yeah, I wondered about diet sodas because often, the stereotype is that, Utahns go to get their dirty sodas at Swig or wherever. And also that often that soda is a diet soda. And so I wondered if this study touched on that at all. And it turns out it didn't. And it also didn't mention, for that matter, like cocktails or, like, say, a beer, like an alcoholic beverage like that. But, she said basically there's been some research on diet soda's impact on metabolic outcomes, such as, like blood sugar levels that might lead to type 2 diabetes risk. But, there's not anything super clear, and it's certainly not what her team was focused on. But she said, diet sodas can help reduce your intake of, regular sodas or juice beverages or something like that. But the safer option is always just drinking something that doesn't have that added sugar, whether it be artificially sweetened or not.
All right, interesting story. And we've been talking to Paighten Harkins. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll have underplayed stories of the week later in the program. We'll head toward a break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. When we come back, we'll be talking with Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune Cache Valley reporter Clarissa Casper. Here's the headline. A Bear Lake namesake returned recently. Then it was struck and killed. We'll have more following this break. You're listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Tom Williams. We turn next to Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune Cache Valley reporter Clarissa Casper, who joins me in studio. Clarissa, thanks.
Hi, Tom. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me. We want to talk first about your story about a Bear Lake namesake. So we're talking about bears right here. I guess what happened recently?
So recently, a black bear was spotted along the shores of Bear Lake, along the East Beach, Cisco Beach, and then unfortunately was struck and killed by a vehicle. But it's kind of sparked this conversation of, are black bears coming back to the area, because they're not very common around the area, despite the name of Bear Lake. They used to be very common around Bear Lake, but they got eradicated, basically. So it's rare to see them coming back. So it's kind of sad that one was killed, but people are kind of wondering if they're coming back now.
And there's a photo, I guess, posted by the state. This black bear looks really cute. Unfortunately, it's very sad. Smaller than I would have imagined. I guess I always imagined big grizzly, but some of these, I guess, blackbirds are a little smaller. Yeah,
and they're like a lot less aggressive, I think.
Yeah. So this one happened to be, I guess, crossing the road, got struck. You talked to some experts let's go back to the history. Of course, it's Bear Lake. We got Bear River up here in the northern part of Utah. It's all bear, it seems like. So at a certain point in history, there were a bunch of bears, black bears, grizzlies.
Yeah. There was black bears, grizzlies. There was tons and tons of them, so much so that the whole area was named after bears. But I think, if I understand it right, the early trappers and early livestock people, the bears were a nuisance to them, and so they kind of were overhunted to the point of them leaving and not being around. The legend has it that the last grizzly bear was killed by an explorer. What's his name? I forgot. But the grizzly's bear is Old Ephraim, and so that's like a famous Cache Valley legend. But it kind of represents what happened here with trappers and bears back then.
So I guess black bears are returning. How do experts know? They just by sightings, or what do they?
Yeah, sightings. So I talked to multiple bear biologists for Utah, and both of them said that in their time working in Utah, they'd never seen black bears in the area. They 20 years ago, started working as a biologist in the state, and they'd never heard of them in the area. And then about 5 years ago, they started seeing them more and hearing of them more. So both of the biologists I spoke to said that they're clearly returning to the area over the past 5-10 years.
Why do we think they're returning?
They're not quite sure. There's no definitive answer, but Julie Young, who's a professor at Utah State University in the Wildland Resources Department, she said that it could be because of milder winters. So the milder the winters, the more deer survive, and so the more food, the more bears. But yeah, it could be that, but they really don't know for sure.
So we think black bears are coming back. What about grizzlies? Any sightings of grizzlies?
No, grizzlies are gone.
Yeah, they're totally gone. Okay. So the experts are saying since black bears are coming back, let's be bear aware. So that means securing your garbage. What else?
Yeah, just always act as if there could be a bear around. Don't act like there's not one at Bear Lake. And yeah, keeping your food safe, keeping your food tied up, being safe, not having anything that smells at your campground, just basic bear aware, but also bear spray while you're hiking. If you see a black bear while hiking, make sounds at it and clap at it because that can scare them away.
Also, I guess just in general, while you're hiking, make noise.
Yeah.
Right? The bear will usually go away from you. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess as always, if you see a mother with her cubs, that's especially dangerous.
Yeah, avoid that.
Yeah. So they are emphasizing that if you do leave food out, bears can become habituated. It's much easier to get food left by humans, right?
Yeah.
That can cause a problem.
Yeah, Julie Young said that, when we think of increased tourism at Bear Lake, we might think, oh, the bears might not benefit from that, but they might actually at first because of the food, but the food's obviously not healthy for them, so that's not good. And then when it becomes a habit, then more bears are around, and then they become more of a problem for people, and then people want to get rid of them, and it's yeah.
So bear spray, I guess, is effective? Carry bear spray?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I think there are different rules for black bears versus grizzlies. Black bears, you can get a little more aggressive, I don't know, fight, but make yourself threatening, but they might leave. Grizzly bears, I understand, you just play dead and hope for the best.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Okay, well, yeah. So I guess it's a great thing that black bears are coming back.
Yeah.
You just need to be aware of them.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about this, another story. This is from last week, but it really affects Logan, Cache Valley, where we are. Here's the headline. This Utah town was scared that tourists wouldn't come this summer. So tell me about these summer citizens.
Yeah, so each summer, Logan welcomes about 600 senior summer citizens to its area because they help the economy thrive up here. They spend, on an average, I think, almost $70 a week here, or a day, not a week, a day. So they come up every summer, and they come up for hiking opportunities, for arts opportunities, but mostly just to get out of the desert sun because most of the people come from Arizona, Texas, southern places.
They stay generally in, student housing, not official student housing, though some of them may, but housing that's usually occupied by students.
Yeah. They can be found in student dorms. I actually was trying to find a group of them and drove by Old Farm in Logan, and they were all sitting outside talking one day.
Yeah, you can see them there on 8th East. But this year was threatened. Why?
So the Utah Festival Opera and Musical Theater announced earlier this year that their season would not be the same this year. They usually have a few shows each summer for people to come watch, and people really look forward to it. But because of financial stuff with COVID and all of that, they said they needed to take a step back this year to kind of financially recover. So they announced that they wouldn't be having their usual repertoire of shows, and so people were really worried that the summer citizens wouldn't come back this summer because they're like a huge portion of the ticket sales for the opera. So the people at the Chamber of Commerce were kind of worried, and so they got to work trying to make up for it.
And various arts groups stepped up. Each one did an extra performance? I
Yeah.
guess, right?
Local musical theater groups last second planned shows, started rehearsing for them to get the summer season full of musical theater for people.
Now, Wendy Hassan, prominent Cache Valley figure, she's head of Cache Valley Center for the Arts, I think. She said, hey, if they don't come this year, we might never get them back.
Yeah, they were worried that if they don't come this year, they're going to look for other places. And, Utah is full of lots of rich arts scenes, so they could go to Tuacahn, they could go to the Hale and Sandy or Pleasant Grove, or, so there's plenty of other places for arts. So they wanted to make sure they kept coming back.
And they did come back, apparently.
Yeah, so they said that this year's summer citizens count isn't lower than usual. They all came back. I talked to a few who were like, yeah, I was sad, but wanted to give it a go. So,
speaking of Utah Festival Opera and musical theater, are they going to do a season next year?
Yes, so they have a cool season planned next year. I believe they're doing the play 1776 starring Michael Ballum. I can't remember what else they're doing, but yeah.
And I think this is not going to be a summer repertory next year. It's going to be spread out through the year.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. But then I think they say they hope in 2 years to come back as a repertory. But as you say, almost, about $60, $70 a day. If you times that by 600, that's a lot of cash injected into Cache Valley.
Yeah, they stay at our hotels, they eat our food. I've heard some stories of summer citizens even come up here to buy a car or to get medical procedures done, which is wild. So, yeah, they really help.
Yeah. We have time for one more story. This is interesting. Here's the headline. Worried about textiles in landfills. This Utahn has an idea for those stained onesies you're trashing. So this is a young lady, 24, I think. She's established a secondhand clothing business. Tell me her idea. I guess onesies tend to have stains on them, poopy stains, I guess, and such. And some people think, well, nobody else is going to want to use this, so I'll throw it away. What's her idea?
Yeah, so she gets a lot of children's clothes into her store. It's called Earthaware in Logan. And so she wanted to kind of create a challenge to inspire people to donate more of their dirty clothes, because she just knows that probably a lot of people don't think to bring their dirty onesies, because people kind of think of onesies as like diapers, like they just go in the trash. So she wanted to have people bring them in and then mass repurpose them. So she tie-dyes them by hand and embroiders them and makes them cute again and then sells them for $5.
She has a goal she's calling it the 10,000 onesie project.
Yeah, so she's trying to collect 10,000 of them. So far, she has about 50.
50, so a ways to go.
Yeah.
But are people bringing in their onesies?
Yeah. People locally have been bringing them in, but you can also send them into her store if you don't live in Logan. So on her website, you can go online and buy a Eartha bag, and it's a big bag, and you can fill it with as much clothes as possible and send it back to her store. It comes with a shipping label.
So she, I guess this is an advertisement for Utah State University. She got this idea, I guess, for her business from a class. Yeah,
she took a social entrepreneurship class where they kind of asked her to create a business that made economic sense, but also social sense and environmental sense. So she wanted to do some good with her business.
So Earthaware is the business.
Yeah, Earthaware.
Yeah, great. Well, Clarissa Casper, thanks for telling us about these stories.
Yeah, thank you.
Clarissa Casper is Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune Cache Valley reporter. Well, let's head toward our underplayed stories of the week, and I'll start with Robert Gehrke. What's your underplayed story of the week, Robert?
Yeah, I'm going to highlight one that Anastasia Huffen did. It just posted this morning, and it's about Lake Powell and how, we had a couple decent water years. Lake came back a little bit, but this year it looks like the forecasts are that it's going to not get very much water and probably drop again. I think they were projecting about 45% of the average water flowing into the river or flowing into the lake this year as usual. So pretty bleak, but you can check it out at sltrib.com.
sltrib.com for that one. Paighten Harkins, what's your underplayed story of the week?
I'm going to do, I guess, a trio of underplayed stories, which is just our various coverage of the upcoming Pride events in Salt Lake City. We've reported that the Pride Parade's going to be shorter than normal. The festival has lost sponsors in the DEI backlash that's happening, and that UTA is not going to participate in the Pride Parade or apparently any parades this year. So all sorts of interesting Pride-related coverage on sltrib.com.
sltrib.com for those stories, yes. Clarissa Casper, what's your underplayed story?
Yeah, mine's kind of from last week, but it's Palak Jaiswal's story on a Navajo Dene artist who creates pet collars with beaded work. I thought it was really just a cute feature.
Interesting, yeah. Haven't seen that. I'll go back and pick that one up. sltrib.com for that one and all the stories we've been talking about. Well, you've been listening to Behind the Headlines, the weekly news roundup from Utah Public Radio and the Salt Lake Tribune. We've had with us politics reporter Robert Gehrke. Robert, thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Have a great weekend.
You too. Reporter Paighten Harkins has been with us. Thank you. And Clarissa Casper, Utah Public Radio and Salt Lake Tribune reporter. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paighten. Appreciate that. And thanks, everyone, for listening. Hope you'll join me again next time.